This is the Sex and Censorship podcast. Welcome back to the Sex and Censorship podcast. This is Jerry Barnett. As ever, you can find us at sexandcensorship.org or follow Porn Panic on Twitter. My book, Porn Panic, can now be ordered online and offline at all good bookshops. This week's interview is with the American psychologist Dr. David J Ley. David has written occasionally for the Sex and Censorship blog and is the author of a book called The Myth of Sex Addiction, in which he debunks the idea that sex or pornography can be addictive and exposes the industry that sells expensive addiction cures. His new book, Ethical Porn for Dicks, offers men a guide to using pornography responsibly and will be published in November. Hi, it's good to finally speak to you at last.
Indeed, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. I think you first contacted me about 2,500. It's been a long day here. About 2.5 years ago, not 2,500 years ago.
Back before Christ, we were both fighting against the battle against cave pornography.
Well, it was a big problem in ancient Greece.
That's right. That's why Pompeii was destroyed. It was those damn dirty pictures on the walls.
Yeah, we know what God thinks about this kind of stuff. I think you contacted me when I started the Sex and Censorship campaign.
Yeah.
And kind of offered to lend a hand, and you clearly have you have a long experience in the whole porn panic business, and kind of understand the nature of this panic to an extent. So I wanted to. I've started the Sex and Censorship podcast. I think this will be the 9th edition, the 9th chapter. And I wanted to talk to you about your work, your writing, and the issue of porn addiction and sex addiction and that kind of stuff.
Yep.
So if you could start by introducing yourself,
Sure.
So explain what you do.
Sure. I'm a clinical psychologist and writer. I'm based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, over in the U.S. And, I'm a little different than a lot of folks kind of in this business in that I work as a very traditional psychologist. I run a mental health agency. We provide substance use treatment. We provide treatment to the very seriously, chronically mentally ill. And for many years, I have practiced. Part of my clinical practice has been working with people with sexuality issues. And one of the things that I've seen over my career is that people in mental health have really abominable levels of training and experience around sexuality issues. What that means, unfortunately, is that they are typically not able to handle or deal with or diagnose or treat sexuality issues when they come up, or more likely they just refer them to somebody else. Well, for many years now, the mental health field has been referring sexuality issues over to the sex addiction industry, and the sex addiction industry is this kind of group that rose up out of substance use addiction and 12-step kind of models. They are predominantly religious in nature, and they intend to offer support and help to people dealing with sexual issues, but unfortunately they oftentimes end up shaming folks and enforcing very conservative, moralistic ideas about what healthy sexuality is. I first encountered these folks a few years ago when I was doing some writing, and I ended up writing a book called The Myth of Sex Addiction as I really explored this concept, this industry. And I went into it at first questioning, was I wrong for not believing in it? Because it's not in the DSM. It's not something that can be legitimately clinically diagnosed.
So the DSM is
DSM is the diagnostic manual that we use in the U.S. for the American Psychiatric Association. It's also, it's really a core document worldwide.
I think it's used here. It's kind of why reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, it really identifies at a base level, what different kinds of mental illnesses are, and it's really important to know that for over 30 years now, the concept of sex addiction or porn addiction has been, just rejected. It's been completely rejected on the basis of bad science. One of the things that came out in 2013 as they were looking at trying to evaluate whether, the concept of sex or porn addiction should be included, they found a couple of really interesting things that I always like to point out. One is that gay and bi men are at 3 times the risk of being called a sex addict compared to heterosexuals. Secondly, that 95% of the people in sex addiction treatment are men, and half of those men are white men who make over $85,000 a year. Now, if I went to you and I said, hey, look, I've got this great new diagnosis, and it just so happens that it diagnoses gay and bi men preferentially, and half of the people we're going to diagnose with this are poor black men, I would be laughed out because, obviously I am proposing something that is based on stigma and racial discrimination. But it's interesting when you propose a disorder that says that rich white guys who get caught putting their penises somewhere they're not supposed to have a disease and it's not their fault. Everybody jumps on the bandwagon and says that's a great idea.
Yeah, I guess that's that's fashionable in politics. Across the board. It's interesting. And kind of men are now responsible for all all the evils in the world according to the latest rewrite of history, and I suppose it helps that if you're earning over $80,000 a year, then you can also afford plenty of sex addiction cure, which might be part of. So that's interesting. So you have this industry, and I guess that's why you approached me, because usually the UK follows behind the US in this kind of stuff. So you had porn a lot before we did, and so you had porn addiction a lot before we did.
The United States has really been ground center of this kind of sex addiction movement. We have more, sex and porn addiction treatment centers than any other place in the country. We really have the hub of this industry. And certain states like Utah, which is one of the most religiously conservative states in the country, just happen to be the state that has the most of these sex and porn addiction treatment programs. What was interesting to me was when I started seeing the concept of porn addiction popping up in the United Kingdom, as folks were arguing there about censorship and filtering of the internet to limit access to pornography. Because Cameron, Gail Dines, who's a United States anti-porn advocate, lots of folks in the United Kingdom debate about pornography, all of a sudden started talking about one of the big dangers of porn was that it could be addictive, that addiction could do things like cause people to rape, turn men into pedophiles, or cause erectile dysfunction. And these are all these kind of myths around porn and porn addiction that, interestingly enough, have been popping up over in the United Kingdom and used as justification for your government's actions to restrict access to this information, this material.
And so the arguments were kind of ready-made and imported by anti-porn campaigners here, and that's what I guess you often see these you get these very sophisticated developments of arguments in the United States, which eventually get adopted wholesale over in the UK, and it seems it's a lot less sophisticated here to an extent, because people are adopting these arguments ready-made, and they've been kind of forged in the heat of America. And of course you have the religious right as well, which we don't really have. So I guess there's a hell of a lot more driving force to create these anti-porn arguments.
What's interesting, in the UK and in some other places that have taken stances against pornography, is that they are adopting these concepts from a kind of core feminist model that pornography harms women, but they don't seem to notice that as they adopt these arguments from the United States, that they are adopting these very conservative attitudes towards what sex is, and what happened in the United Kingdom as they did porn filtering, for instance, and it just so happened that a bunch of the porn that they were censoring and limiting access to was LGBT porn and female dominant porn. And that the porn that these people kind of had a big problem with was porn where women were powerful and in charge. That's a very odd stance for people to take as they are arguing that they need to protect women.
Yeah, I mean, the protection of women comes into this a lot, and I guess, I've just written my book, which comes out next month. I plug it in every podcast. It's called Porn Panic, and it really looks at the background to this movement, which popped up in the UK only about 10 to 12 years ago, but really the anti-porn feminist arguments were forged again in the US in the late 70s, early 80s and onwards. And as you say, there's a remarkable kind of convergence between these so-called supposedly left-wing feminists and these right-wing Christian crazies who want to stop us all having sex. And it's remarkable how similar their goals are and how similar, when you cut away the presentation, their arguments are.
The thing I struggle with in there is I really wish these people would ever have a transparent discussion about what they think sexual health is. And ultimately, that is the missing piece of a lot of this argument. The idea of porn addiction itself is basically people say, look, you can watch porn, but it's when you start having a problem that's an addiction and we need to help you. The challenge there is that many of these problems are encountered as people's behavior conflicts with social expectations. And
so, as you said, in Utah, there's a lot more porn addiction than everywhere else because people are going to identify their masturbation as problematic.
That's right, and that is one of the things that we're now seeing very clearly is that people that are identifying themselves as porn addicts actually watch less porn than many other people, especially atheists. Atheists are not reporting many significant levels of problems with porn, but it is people who were raised in religious or very morally kind of conservative families where their attitudes towards sex are very conservative. And as those people now grow up in a world and live in a world where they can have access to sexual material at a moment's notice on their phone or on the computer, they're not prepared to handle that. And that temptation is something that they're not they don't have any grounding to deal with, and then as they struggle with that desire and incorporating it in their life, integrating it in their life, and resolving the conflict between their behavior and their morals, that's where they end up feeling as though they're out of control. But it's very different between feeling out of control and actually being out of control. So then they claim porn addiction. Now, religious therapists and religiously minded therapists are the ones who are predominantly diagnosing porn addiction. So what we have here is a conflict. We have a conflict between outdated moral values towards sex and the modern world. Now, the porn addiction folks and the anti-porn folks, they would like to go back to the good old days where we didn't have porn. But the reality is we had porn back then, but it was underground. In many cases it was illegal. And in fact it was less safe in those situations. There was less confidence that the performers in that porn were consenting and that were legal to make it. And the more restrictions that get put on porn, actually the more dangerous and harmful it potentially makes it, and the more shame that is on the people who are using it. Now, one of the other things that I talk about a lot here is, again, we're talking about men who are using pornography, and it is predominantly men who are getting in trouble for using pornography. And we then need to think about and understand why men use pornography, and sometimes use pornography at problematic levels. The reality is that men use pornography and sex as a coping mechanism, as a way to deal with stress and depression and anxiety. For many years, the porn addiction folks have said, oh, look, there are all these men that are using lots of porn and they have lots of emotional problems. And they blame the porn for the emotional problems. The reality is, in those cases,
it's a classic confusion of correlation and causation.
Absolutely. Causality went the other way. These men are depressed and anxious, and then they start using porn. Now, one of the reasons they are often depressed or anxious is because they're divorcing, or they're in a marriage where their sexuality is shamed. They want more sex or a different kind of sex than their wife does, and they're not able to talk about that. And those men need help to understand what sexuality is for them. They need help to identify other ways to cope with their negative emotions. They need ways to learn how to talk to their wife or partner about what porn and sex is for them, and how watching porn is not cheating or taking something away from the wife. Unfortunately, in this dialogue, what ends up happening is people blame porn. But porn is just a symptom. Porn is a tip of the iceberg of a lot of other really significant individual, interpersonal, and social issues that aren't being examined. Instead, people just scapegoat porn, and they say, we got to get rid of porn, and that'll take care of all these issues. But back in 1919 in the United States, very similar arguments were used to justify prohibition of alcohol. They said alcohol, a tiny moral group who blamed alcohol for divorce, for crime, for all kinds of social ills, they got the United States to ban alcohol from a Puritan kind of standpoint. 10 years later, they had to pull that back because even without legal alcohol, all those social problems still existed, and we had to acknowledge, oh, wait, most people use alcohol in harmless ways, and we can't fix those issues by focusing just on alcohol. It's a whole big other issue. But unfortunately, conservative governments and these moral zealots, they want simple answers, and instead of talking about the issues of poverty, instead of talking about sex education, instead of talking about gender divides and conflicts in relationships and stuff like that, it's much easier and simplistic to just say, oh, look, see, there's the problem, porn.
Yeah, and I guess, there are huge cultural changes going on as well. So we live in a world today where people have other options. They can go outside of their relationship for sex far more easily than they used to be able to do.
Yeah.
Where monogamy to an extent is eroding, if it wouldn't say breaking down, but it's certainly less the norm than it used to be.
Yeah,
and so if you're in a relationship which isn't satisfying you sexually, there are far more options, and there's far less stigma to going and doing something about that today than there was 50 years ago.
And while porn definitely has its problems, it is a fantasy and it's not realistic sex. Porn is actually very good for society. Porn decreases rates of sexual violence and sex crime. Having access to pornography in societies reduces the rates of rape. Men who watch more pornography are more feminist and more accepting of female empowerment. And access to porn actually decreases infidelity. And if people could talk about it in those ways and start to acknowledge, hey, just like television, just like the automobile, this is a new kind of invention. This is a new media that is changing how we think about sex, how we think about the world, how we think about each other, how we think about relationships. We need to figure out how to integrate and incorporate our morals, our decisions, and our judgment. But we're not. We're just saying porn bad.
Yeah, and to an extent, so that this isn't just about a backlash against sex; it's a backlash against a new technology, and society is very used to that kind of thing. You hear about, the train was going to make women infertile,
or the bicycle seat was going to turn women into insatiable lesbians. I
think that happened actually, right? For sure. And I find it. One of the things we touched on earlier, which I find really interesting, is the kind of the difference in the nature of the discussion between the US and the UK, because the overtly religious kind of stuff that's acceptable over there doesn't really happen over here. So what you have is this kind of feministization, if that's a word, of the arguments, where the religion is stripped out and it's rephrased in terms of harm to women and children, which actually isn't a very feminist message at all when you start to group women and children together, right, as a kind of as victims.
Very disempowering kind of argument. And the challenge in all of this is that in many of these issues there is kind of a grain of truth. For instance, porn exposure in teens does explain some of the later behavior of those teens as they struggle with issues like education problems or drug problems or relationship problems. However, porn exposure explains less than 1% of the variance of those kids' behaviors. And we are focusing way too much on porn when we should be talking about sex education, health care, a healthy family, and the issues of poverty. But people don't want to talk about those things. Those are not issues that are easy to fix, and they're not issues that many governments are very actually committed to addressing. So instead of addressing the issues that are causing 99% of the problem, hey, let's talk about porn.
Yeah.
And as somebody who has dedicated my career, in fact, to help poor people and young people and the disenfranchised who are dealing with mental health and social issues, I got to tell you, it infuriates me to see people spending money, time, and effort with all of this panic around porn. I love your term porn panic because it really does capture, hey, this is a moral panic, this is a moral distraction in response to these social issues. One of the things I hear often, people say, oh, internet porn is the crack cocaine of sex addiction. And that always makes me laugh when somebody says that, because it reveals their ignorance. That in the 1990s, there was the idea that crack cocaine was 6 or 10 times more addictive than regular cocaine. And so laws were passed preferentially punishing crack cocaine offenders in the United States. There was the idea that crack babies, if you remember the crack baby epidemic.
Yeah.
That,
we had a lot less of that scare here, but yeah, we definitely had all that stuff as well.
And it didn't happen. Crack babies, it turns out, isn't a real thing. That crack in utero doesn't actually have a long-term effect on infants. Certainly not compared to things like alcohol and poverty. And it just so happens.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it turns out, I think, crack was just a cheaper form of cocaine, and guess poorer people were using it, and it was causing more problems.
It was about poor people, and it was about African American people being punished. Again, that was a moral panic, and it was sadly a place where the medical and the mental health profession was used by society to punish the disenfranchised.
And I guess on the other side of the coin from the moral panic, where you have kind of campaigners with an agenda trying to get governments to change laws, then you have the state response. And it's interesting because I've never thought David Cameron, R.I.P. He's no longer our leader, but he's actually by conservative standards, he's an extremely liberal person. He was the person who pushed through gay marriage in the UK, for example. So, the way it worked in politics over here was that he actually was a fairly liberal conservative. He had a right wing in his party keep happy, and a lot of this porn stuff seems to have been his way of, just throwing a few bones to the right to keep them quiet. So unfortunately, we now have a more right-wing prime minister, and possibly things are going to get worse. But the other side, which sorry, go ahead.
There was research just published that shows that people with stronger conservative political and religious values believe that porn is a greater issue than gun violence or racism, and so it makes sense that these politically conservative are doing things like focusing on porn instead of addressing violence and the terrorism and the racism that is happening. I mean, they would rather declare a war on porn than address the problem of the religious conflict, racial issues that are killing people. I mean,
sorry, David, I've lost you for a minute there.
It's like cigarettes back in the 1950s. And I've even been accused of being a doctor, like the doctors were back in the 1950s who were prescribing people to smoke. But when people say that to me, I always ask them, how many people died last year from porn? Because 6 billion people died worldwide from tobacco-related disease, but I don't know of anybody that porn killed.
Sure. The anti-porn arguments are fascinating, and they've been crafted over decades. I mean, one thing that I find quite amusing is the split over here between the political left and right, because generally there's this thing among feminists that they tend to reject biological determinism. They don't like the idea that we're slaves to our genes, and so they say, in general, they don't think that our behaviors are biologically determined, and they get angry if you suggest they are. And the one exception that they'll make is homosexuality. They'll go, oh no, homosexuality is innate, it can't be cured, don't be silly. And then on the right, you have this kind of complete, people on the right can't accept that homosexuality may be an innate behavior, so they reject it altogether. But across the board on the left and the right, you have this idea that sexuality can be cured. The left thinks it's kind of these nasty behaviors, masturbating to porn or whatever, and the people on the right think it's homosexuality, but actually they've adopted very similar myths, just kind of different myths that fit with their political beliefs.
Right. I mean, a couple of years ago in the United Kingdom, they Valerie Boone, as a brain researcher who was paid by a media show out there that was putting a documentary together to do a brain study comparing the brains of people who use lots of porn to the brains of alcoholics, and there was this big furor saying, oh, look, see, porn affects the brain, and porn damages people's brains, and we need to stop letting people watch porn because it's warping their brains. Well, a couple of years later, Valerie Boone published a study and said, no, we can't say that yet because we don't know what came first, chicken or the egg. We don't know what people's brains were like first, and there are all of these other issues that we can't explain yet in this. But just as you said, the anti-porn folks grabbed onto this and made it a biologically based kind of argument, taking away people's agency and choice and responsibility, and saying, look, we need to protect people from porn because it's changing their brains, instead of what I think is more of a feminist argument, which is to say, hey, let's hold people responsible for their choices and help them make better choices.
I think this is kind of the fundamental problem with the feminist argument against porn is that feminists used to say rapists are responsible for rape, and now they say, oh no, rapists aren't responsible for rape, they're being made to rape by external influences over which they have no control. It's kind of almost, it's a 180-degree reversal.
Yeah, and on the other side of that is that they are constantly taking away women's ability to enjoy porn or to enjoy performing in porn by asserting that there is a certain kind of sexuality that is healthy for women. And rough sex is the kind of porn that is searched for by women at about 3 times the rate of men. Women are far more interested in pornography that is kind of rough and aggressive. And we need to deal with that. We need to allow women to have that desire and not shame them for it, and to put it in context and help them understand what that desire means or doesn't mean, and how they incorporate that desire in their real life and in their real relationships in a healthy way. We're not having that conversation because we are shaming women for that desire and connecting it to rape, which is really sad and scary, and it makes women be unwilling to talk about that. We're also shaming the women who perform in porn and kind of saying, oh, these are all damaged women that are just being further exploited. And the reality couldn't be further from the truth. Most female porn performers are intelligent, very self-driven women who enjoy sexual excitement and have found a really fascinating way to make that part of their life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what got me interested in this whole area of campaigning was a few years ago, a stripper friend who had encountered anti-sex feminists for the first time and came away shocked because they were telling her that she was responsible for rape and domestic violence and a whole range of other, she was completely blown away by that. I realize you're short on time, so I think we should kind of wrap up fairly soon. I just wanted to quote from a blog post that on our blog that you wrote a couple of years ago, which was about the introduction of porn filters and so on. And you wrote, "I'm sad to say that the people of the United Kingdom may need to get out your rape whistles and attend personal defense classes." And this was basically the idea that the more we censor porn and around that, the more that we stigmatize sexuality in general, the more dangerous life becomes, and the likelihood is that there's going to be a rise in sexual violence. I mean, is that still your belief?
It certainly is, one of my fears. The porn filtering attempts, in the UK apparently failed. But it's fascinating that the EU said, you can't censor the internet. That's censorship. And now we've got Brexit, and everybody is kind of waiting to see what's next.
That's one of the many catastrophic implications of Brexit, is that the EU will stop our government, won't be there to stop our government doing stupid things anymore.
Right. I think we are all living in unfortunately kind of a scary world. I mean, over here in the United States, we're watching Donald Trump, who really is saying and thinking a lot of the same stuff, and as a scientist, as a healthcare practitioner, I want us making good decisions for the right reasons. And what unfortunately I see is a big tendency to make these knee-jerk reactionary decisions based on keeping certain loud people happy, and unfortunately making everybody else suffer. And consistently when that happens, years later we have to pull those decisions back and spend decades repairing the harm. When it comes to sex, that is one of the great fears and tendencies, is for people to make those knee-jerk harmful decisions to restrict the rights of other people, because everybody is afraid of other people's sexuality. Everybody is just sure that their sex is okay, but it's yours that is messed up and disturbed. We need to move away from that. Now, internet porn has actually helped us move away from that by helping us acknowledge the diversity of sexual interests that are out there. But society is changing sexually, as you said, in a lot of ways, with gay marriage, with bondage and discipline, and we need to start addressing that and developing new, modern attitudes and values towards sex to help people make responsible decisions. My new book, actually, it's coming out here in a month or two, is called Ethical Porn for Dicks, A Man's Guide to Responsible Viewing Pleasure. And it's a book for men about how to watch porn responsibly and mindfully, understanding what it is and isn't in their life.
Yeah, you sent me a review copy of that, and that was a really entertaining read. I enjoyed that. So is that going to be available in the UK as well?
Oh, yeah, it'll be available on Amazon. The Kindle version is expected out in about a month or two, and then the print version is out November 2016.
Okay, so that's Ethical Porn for Dicks, so people should keep an eye out and pre-order that. Okay, well, I'd like to thank you for your time. Hopefully we could maybe have a catch-up again in a few months and explore some of these issues in greater detail. But thank you very much, David.
Hey, thank you. And Jerry, I just want to say how much I appreciate what you're doing. I mean, I think that each country in each area really has to fight this fight for themselves to defend sexual freedom and to defend against the kind of sex panic that is constantly happening. So I am just so thrilled that you are leading the charge in the United Kingdom against these folks who want to take away other people's ability to enjoy sex and enjoy porn.
Great. That's really appreciated. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.